Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Friendly City Books podcast. Today, I'm doing an author interview with Jess Everlee. Say hello.
Hello.
Hi, Jess. Today we're going to be talking about your new book, A Bluestocking's Guide to Decadence, which I had the pleasure of reading. I just finished it, and I absolutely adore it. Now, this book comes out first week of June, June 6th?
June 4th.
June 4th.
Yep.
See, I did this on the last podcast too, where I didn't know the actual number of the day. But first Tuesday in June.
Mhm.
And I think it's a great way to kick off Pride Month, personally. I thought this book was adorable. So for listeners who haven't heard of this book yet, it is a queer historical romance. And it is a sapphic romance, which probably explains why I'm here. And I just can't wait to talk about this book with you. I loved pretty much everything about it, but I know that this is the third in a series that you've written. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Lucky Lovers of London series it'll be 4 books by the time it is through. It's a series of Victorian era queer love stories. So it takes place in sort of the early to mid 1880s in London. And it focuses just kind of on this community, this sort of imagined community of like what a queer space could have looked like in that time and place. There is some like information and things about that I kind of drew from research, but a lot of it is also stuff that I just kind of put together. So it's been a lot of fun. The first 2 books are gay romances, so the characters are all men. But then this was the first one that is a sapphic romance, and it was a lot of fun to write, and I was really looking forward to it. I've been planning it from the very beginning. So that's kind of that's the series. That's the gist of it.
Awesome. So what made you want to write a queer historical romance series?
So I actually was originally writing fantasy. And I was actually writing fantasy for years and years and trying to break into the industry. And eventually I just kind of burned out on that. And I was like, I need to do something else. I need to write something else. I can't do this anymore. And I decided to write a romance because I had started reading a little bit of romance. I had heard that it can be a good place to get published. So I started reading more of it, started learning more about it, and then needed to decide, well, okay, I'm going to try to write a romance. What kind of romance am I going to try to write? And I realized it had to be something I'd be very interested in. And the Victorian era is something that I'm interested in. I studied Victorian literature in college. I also found I myself am queer, I am bisexual, and I am drawn to queer stories. And when I was reading romance, was drawn to queer romances as well. So I kind of put those things together. I was like, well, it'll be fun if it's gay, and it'll be fun if it's Victorian, and I'll have a great time writing it. And I didn't really expect it to go anywhere. Kind of figured I'd just try it out or self-publish it maybe, but things like the stars kind of aligned with it. And I did end up being able to publish it as a series through one of Harlequin's imprints. And it's been fantastic. And since then, I have read more romance and obviously written more and just like kind of gotten like really into that genre. And it's been very exciting. It's been a really fun process.
Yeah, it's such a broad genre. I feel like I didn't even realize how broad it was until I started doing my podcast based on queer stories, the Make It Gay podcast here on Friendly City Books Podcast Network. And I was doing research for our romance episode, and I'm not a huge romance reader myself. So like it was kind of a beginning of an adventure for me, but historical romances have always been my favorite. And on that podcast, my co-host, she said that she thinks that historical romances are like for the fantasy readers. And I was like,
Interesting.
Yeah, because it makes sense when you think about it, because there's so much like romanticized, notion towards like the Victorian era, and it does almost, or any really historical era, and it does almost feel kind of like a fantasy now when you look back.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation,
right?
I think she's onto something.
I think she is too, because I'm a big fantasy fan, so she at least got me. So, out of these books, which one was your favorite to write?
So I know I'm supposed to say it's the new release because that's the one coming out. But which book is my favorite is mostly based on what was going on while I was writing it. And I was
Mm-hmm.
really in the best place while I was writing the second book, a rule book for Restless Rogues.
Mm-hmm.
So that one was a fun time. It has some flashbacks and things in it. It's a friends to lovers story as well, which is closer to my own romance in my own life. So I really enjoyed doing the friends to lovers thing and having those flashback elements. Bluestockings, well, I'm so excited that it's out there and I love the characters. I think Joe and Emily are actually probably my favorite characters. There was a lot going on while I was writing it, so I barely even
Yeah.
remember writing at this point.
That's fair. That's totally
Yes.
fair. I agree though. Joe and Emily are really great characters. Like I found both of them to be very um just interesting to read about. And also this one's more enemies to lovers, I would
It
say,
is. Yes.
which I love. I think everybody loves a good enemies to
Oh.
lovers. Like friends to lovers, I think is more realistic to life.
Mhm.
But enemies to lovers, again, I think satisfies that like fantastical urge.
Yeah,
you
we're not
know,
necessarily here to be realistic to life all
exactly,
the time.
exactly. Although I did actually want to ask about some questions that are connected to real life and real history, because you did say, you know, you've done some research
Mhm.
into Victorian literature and stuff like that. And I knew some of the things that occurred in the novel to be based off of historical fact
Mhm.
from my own personal reading and study. So I really want to talk about like the historical inspiration behind the book as well. First and foremost, how like historically accurate would you say the representations of relationships are in your books? Like was the Victorian period gayer than we think it was?
The short answer is yes. The Victorian era was definitely gayer than we think it was. I will be the first to admit when it comes to like every single clothing and technological detail, I am probably not going to be the author that is necessarily going to have everything correct. However, it was very important to me to write relationships that could have existed in this time and place. And I tried to choose characters and choose situations that were less fantastical than say in historic romance you see a lot of like nobility and things like that, people with a lot of notoriety and a lot of eyes on them and just a lot of different considerations. But we know from people's letters, we know from the sort of the things people sneak into fiction, some photography, people were certainly managing to put together and sustain queer relationships even in Victorian England. And there are some differences too I can get into at some point if you want. The gay men or queer women, they were treated very differently and also treated very binary
Mhm.
in that time period, and things were definitely a little bit different for each of those demographics as well. But yes, I would say yes. I do believe that based on the research I did, any of the relationships that I show in this particular series could happen.
Yeah, that's really great. And you did talk about this a little bit, I think, in the novel. Just the difference with what you brought up with gay men and gay women at
Mhm.
the time, where gay sex between two men was completely illegal,
Mhm.
and you could be imprisoned if you were caught.
Mhm.
So it was, you know, tough. But there was less legislation on two women having sex. There was less like it wasn't written into the code like it was for men.
Right. And I mean, it's not for like a great reason, right? Like the reason is because like Victorians didn't think women had sex, like sexual feelings if men weren't involved. Like there's some
Yeah.
weird medical literature and things about like getting orgasms from uh,
Mhm.
conception and things like that. Like they had ideas about
Yeah.
stuff that they just said they didn't really wrap their head around it. So loving intimate relationships between unmarried women, like Joe and Emily, it's kind of like nobody's even really paying a whole lot of attention
Mhm.
to it because no one's imagining what could be going on behind the closed doors.
Yeah, so it's this image of the woman as like a purely non-sexual being,
Yeah.
I guess.
And
Yeah.
it creates kind of a funny thing. Now you kind of look back and you can see relationships that to us clearly look like lesbian relationships, and they're like encouraged at that time. Like, yes, they love each other so much with their whole hearts. And
yes, the bosom friend, as they were
correct.
known.
Yes, they're
Yeah.
such good friends. Victorian style.
I love that.
Yes.
I love just thinking about gay people continuing to be gay, despite the odds.
Yep.
So something I also wanted to address is the title of this book, which I thought was a very cool title, A Bluestocking's Guide to Decadence. And it does feature two keywords, in my opinion. The first being bluestocking and the second being decadence. So I'd like to address bluestocking first. For any listeners who don't know, what is a bluestocking?
So this is I'm gonna be dividing a little bit by time period. So originally, the Bluestocking Society was actually much earlier than my books take place. That was a 1700s situation of women who took it upon themselves to become educated together. There were this society, and they would meet up and they would read and they would learn and they would become educated in spite of the social pressures to not be educated. They were not necessarily seen in a very positive light. So by the time we get to the late 19th century, bluestocking is sort of a derogatory term for a bookish woman. So Emily is the bluestocking in this situation, where she is very prim, she's very proper, she's very, very bookish, very, she is a doctor. She managed to become a physician in this time period. And so that is Emily, but it is used in a derogatory fashion, even with Jo, because they're both kind of outside of society. It's in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the central conflicts in the book for Emily is dealing with, because she is a female doctor, being kind of pigeonholed into women's issues and not necessarily wanting to specialize in obstetrics or gynecology. Mm-hmm. So is this like something that you've seen? Because when I picture doctors of the time, obviously I do picture men. And even when it comes to things like obstetrics and gynecology, was there some kind of like confusion of like, the difference between a doctor who was a woman and like I don't know, not a nurse, but like a wet nurse or like a midwife?
Mm-hmm. So very interestingly, I actually approached this book when I was originally planning it. I had an idea that Emily was like, she's this rare physician that, there's not a lot of female physicians, and she's going to actually do things to improve the maternity field. That was my just like original idea. It's like by the end, she's gonna, be doing something to move that forward. But when I actually then dug in to do the research for the book, I found there was actually quite a movement to get more female physicians practicing, because Victorian morality is so just strict and gendered that they felt very uneasy about male doctors doing intimate medicine on women. So there was actually a surprise, like a much bigger, almost push from some people in society to like protect women's modesty by making sure that there were female physicians, particularly in gynecology and obstetrics. And so that kind of ruined my original plan, but it was also very, very interesting, and then kind of gave me this different twist where Emily could be being pigeonholed, because that is like the whole almost purpose of educating women in medicine at this particular time, is so that they can do these sort of women's things. So that was a little interesting thing that happened while I was doing the research.
Yeah, that is interesting. Just like the mystery of women's bodies that I think, honestly, probably due to some of the censorship and stuff that happened during that period, is still to some of us a bit of a mystery today. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting, and an interesting facet of your research. Mm-hmm. So the next word that I wanted to address was decadence, because Decadence is not only in the title, but it appears very frequently in the book. It comes up quite a bit that Jo is decadent, that Emily is not decadent, and Emily is learning to become decadent. So why did you choose the word decadence, and what do you think makes this story a decadent one?
So decadence is actually a movement in the Victorian era that people would apply to themselves. And people like Jo and her husband, Paul Smithy, would, as they are, for anyone, just to make sure that people who are listening know, they own a press that publishes pornography. And people who were involved in things like erotica and pornography at that time, a lot of the time they associated themselves with this decadent movement of sort of setting aside that Victorian morality and focusing more on pleasure and hedonism and this type of nonconformity to their society. And so in the one sense, I mean, it is, she's decadent. I mean, she goes to her sapphic societies. She knows how to have a good time. She even hangs out at the gay bar and drinks a lot of whiskey. So she is like the technical definition of like decadent, but she is a uppercase D decadent as well, meaning she's aligned with a particular philosophy that was going on at that time that is just like diametrically opposed with Emily's sort of philosophy. They're both outside society, but man, they are like on different sides of the outside of the society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, I feel like you could almost define their two differences as like Emily is on the outside and wants to get back in, and Jo was in and is decidedly happy to be out now. At least that's a feeling I got from it. Would you say that that's accurate?
I mean, I can see what you mean by that. I think it's a little different than the way that I look at it, but as you say it, like I can see what you mean, like that Emily would almost hope that society would catch up with her.
Yeah.
That she would be normal again because they would catch up and they would catch on. That didn't really happen though. The sort of like that she's in that sort of like Unitarian Congregationalist, like there's a lot going on there for that they're not very popular either.
No. Yeah.
Her particular sort is also not super cool. So it's not cool to be too prim, but not cool to be too decadent either. You got to get that.
Yeah. Had a lot of rules back then, huh?
Yeah.
So, you mentioned that Jo is married to a man. Mm-hmm. So for listeners who might be like, wait, I thought this was a sapphic romance. It is. So Jo is in what was known as a lavender marriage. Can you describe what lavender marriages are?
Yeah, the term lavender marriage comes a little bit later than the time period, but it's very helpful for marketing because it's a bit of a shorthand that either people have heard before or they can kind of maybe piece it together. So a lavender marriage would be a sort of marriage, it's a type of marriage of convenience, basically, where one or both of the members of this marriage are queer, and that marriage is helpful for allowing them to continue to participate in society and also potentially as a cover-up for their actual sexual and romantic lives. And so Jo did not start necessarily in one of those. She did attempt, they did attempt like a real sort of marriage, but by the time the book opens, they're basically friends with shared assets and some paperwork and business partners as well. So they have a very close friendship, but the marriage itself is for convenience purposes.
Now, Paul is, as far as I can tell from the book, straight. I don't know if you had any like headcanons of him. Maybe
I can't remember if any of those little comments ended up in the final book. I know I had some in some draft, but I can't.
I mean, he was definitely eccentric.
Yes.
So I could see how like that would have been in the initial vision, but I don't recall any specific like.
You've probably read it more recently than I have.
So yeah, I just finished it yesterday. So. Yeah, put off my homework. So he does have a female lover, though, during this novel, and she becomes pregnant, and she's older, so it is considered a high-risk pregnancy. You said in your bio that you have studied public health topics. Do you know anything about women's healthcare during this time period and what it would have looked like?
I do. So I studied a little bit. I actually taught Lamaze classes for 5 years. So I know quite a bit just about women's healthcare. I know a lot about childbirth and pregnancy and things like that. And then also have an interest, obviously, in it. So I was able to kind of dive in. Women's healthcare at this time was honestly kind of horrifying. And I don't put a lot of medical stuff in this book for for that reason. Like, it's a romance. We don't want a lot of leeches and whatever. But kind of what's salient for the book is Vanessa is facing this sort of high risk pregnancy. She's feeling very ill. She's having some different issues. And the problem is that she is also outside of society. So she is an actress. She is in this like non-married relationship with Paul. She has no interest really in being married. So Jo maybe has some worries about how long she's going to feel that way. But as a result of that, it's difficult to get good medical care. So there were hospitals that were dedicated to women who were in unfortunate situations. However, to be able to get a bed in one of those hospitals, you basically had to have a sponsor. So you had to have your sob story, and it had to, touch the right heart of the right doctors to be able to get the bed in this particular hospital. And so the chances of her being able to do that, to access what would be sort of the best medical care that she can get, which would be a hospital, which is frankly at that time not fantastic anyway, she's sort of at a loss. So she's kind of looking at having to have her high risk birth just kind of at home with her actress friends. And that doesn't look like it's going to end very well, which is why Jo enlists Emily's help, because really the best way to give birth at that time would have been at home with a physician who knows what they're doing, or a midwife who trained in some of those more medical things, because infection was extremely high in Victorian era hospitals. Germ theory just it was around, but it just hadn't really gotten as much traction as you would have liked to see. So being in a hospital in general is still not the best place to be just yet.
Yeah. So it actually was a little bit intriguing to me that they went with a physician as opposed to a midwife. You'd think that midwives would maybe have been more accessible. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that was like an interesting, maybe it's because she was a high risk pregnancy that they wanted somebody that was like a doctor. But I did note that, since she was basically functioning in a lot of ways as at least a modern midwife would, where she was guiding her through the entire pregnancy and the birth process, which was interesting to read. Definitely, I really enjoyed kind of seeing, and I know that, this is still like a historical based romance, but still the idea of them being women doctors at the time, and what that would have looked like that was very interesting. I don't know that I have read a historic book that featured a woman doctor before, so I loved
feel like
that.
I've heard of some, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. I'm almost positive it's not.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are some. I just personally haven't encountered it yet.
I know there's one in my brain somewhere. I can't think of it right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. But I thought that was still like a unique take, especially, for romance, which, like you said, it more commonly focuses on the elite. And this is definitely more of a working class romance, which I appreciated. I think that that's a different, interesting take. So another thing that pops up a lot in this book, you noted it a little bit earlier, is sapphic societies and underground gay clubs. Did you do any research on these sorts of societies in the Victorian era? How prevalent were they?
Yeah, so it was easier to find information about gay spaces because they were heightened versions of at least what people wanted appear in Victorian pornography. So I could at least like see like aesthetically what were people maybe interested in seeing if they went out into some kind of underground space. And then there are, you know, sadly court records of when places have been raided and then what those places may have looked like. I never did quite find evidence of a place quite like the club in the books that I write, The Curious Fox. A lot of the spaces were either private spaces, or if they were public, the ones that we know about were generally brothels as well. But like, I feel like the whole point is to come up with one where they're not going to get caught and they're not going to get raided and we're not going to hear about them. So I just kind of like pieced all of those little things together to create, you know, what seemed to be like, you know, maybe there was something like this and we just never heard of it because they never got caught. Yay. So that's The Curious Fox. That's the gay club. And then the Sapphic Society, I actually had not nearly as easy a time finding info because again, like people just kind of act like lesbians didn't really exist in that.
Well, and it was probably easily masqueraded as like a woman's group, you know,
Correct.
like a book club.
Yes, a book club. They're Bluestockings, things like that. They're also just not sort of associated with like partying or like they're not associated with the decadent side, to be honest. Like the Victorian, you know, spinster who you might think is a lesbian is actually, that archetype is probably closer to Emily, where they're just staying home and knitting together or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So it was actually kind of fun. I kind of just, you know, I took what I could find and I invented the rest the way I would want it to be. If I were Victorian heading into a Sapphic space, what would I hope that it was like? And so that's kind of what I did. And it was a really fun exercise and a fun opportunity. And the fact that there are these sort of working class underground spaces, I do have sort of the freedom to imagine because we don't really know for sure what might have been going on.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I love the name of the Sapphic Society as well, by the way, the Orchid and the Pearl, which, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, if you know, you know.
Yes.
I thought that was a great, perfect name. If I was going to join a Sapphic Society, I think I would be looking for one called something like the Orchid and the Pearl.
Exactly. Same.
But honestly, what you were saying reminds me even of, you know, things we see now where a lot of the gay clubs that exist are still geared towards gay men. And there's this kind of association that it's the gay men that want to go out and party and do stuff like that. Whereas like when you do see, you know, Sapphic oriented spaces, they're more likely to be like lounges, you know,
right.
Grab yourself a craft cocktail and chill kind of a vibe, which I mean, admittedly, they got me. That is what I would prefer. They're not wrong. But I think that's interesting that I feel like that dynamic, you know, it still exists and is still very prevalent.
Make a good point.
Yeah, like the Sapphic clubs didn't survive as long as the gay clubs have. There used to be a huge Sapphic club scene in, you know, like San Francisco and stuff like that, and it's not quite the same anymore.
Yeah, I've heard that. I know that I've heard there's some like movements and things to try to like save the remaining
lesbian bars. Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely some sort of a push to see more of them. And I've seen like content creators and stuff who have toured like the ones that are still around in the country. They all look incredible. Yeah. But yeah, save your local lesbian bar if you have one. So another question kind of associated with the club scene that I had is that one of the main characters, Joe, is frequently wearing like men's clothes or traditionally men's clothes and is kind of considered to be a cross-dresser. And another character, Emily's brother, Noah, you know, is described as having done drag and having a drag persona as well. Do you know, was there a Victorian drag scene?
Yes, there was a big Victorian drag scene. So
I love it.
obviously, polite society did not want to connect this to any actual queerness. So they just told themselves it was all entertainment. But drag-based entertainment, they were referred to generally as male or female impersonators at this time. It was hugely popular in the late Victorian period. There is actually interesting, if you want to read more about this, the story of Fanny and Stella are two drag artists, but also likely trans women as we would understand them at this time, who were very popular and very active in a little bit earlier than when this book is set. I believe it was in 1871 that they were actually arrested for doing sex work. And there was a huge, like very public trial about, they were always seen sort of dressed like women, out and about town, but they were these really popular performers. Everybody just loved it, and they didn't want to see them in trouble. And it was a very harrowing trial, I would assume, for these two. But by the end, they were let off, and went on to continue to do their performances, and they were very well loved by the populace. So it's an interesting thing. Nobody wants to hear they're doing anything in their private life, but as long as they're on stage, very well loved.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense because when you think about it, I mean, women probably would have only recently gained access to the stage, maybe a century or two ago, which in the grand scheme is relatively recently. You think back to, Shakespeare, when all of those female characters, all of them would have been portrayed by men. So, I guess drag's been around.
It has, sure has.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I love thinking of the Victorian drag scene. In my head, it's very like burlesque, but I don't know. That might be like I'm picturing like Moulin Rouge, but that's probably just my modern sensibility.
And then they're French, so the French are just a whole different situation.
That's true. The French are a whole different situation.
I don't know much about that. Just that's not my wheelhouse, but
right. Yes. All I know is the rumors.
Right.
I don't think it would have been quite as scandalous for this man's lover to have been with child. I think that would just be
probably not
a normal Tuesday.
Probably, as far as I can tell.
No, we poking fun, but still, I think that's really, really cool, and I love that you featured like the drag scene in the book and kind of made nods to that. It's definitely like an undertone. It's something that you reference, but I loved the referencing. I would love to see, just a book idea, but maybe the next one could be about a drag queen. That'd be
maybe, yeah. So Noah is in the second book. He's one of the heroes. Noah and David are the characters in that one. Noah doesn't perform though. I don't have any drag performers.
Okay.
They're dressing up when they go out. Like he dresses up, which was a common practice at these sorts of spaces for some people to dress in drag. And then Jo just dresses how she's going to dress, and she's in the middle of the West End London, so nobody's really too concerned because everybody's just a little bit weird. A lot of performers and things, you can kind of get away with a lot more than I think you would assume, so long as you aren't trying to be in polite society. But it might be fun to do the performance part.
Yeah, that would be cool. I would like to read it. So just putting that out there.
All right.
So one of my last like historical based questions is actually about Paul, who we established is a printer who prints pornography. Smut is really popular right now. Like I think it's made a resurgence in the romance market.
Yeah.
And so I think we're all wondering what Victorian smut was like.
Well, you don't have to wonder because it is like all available on Project Gutenberg. So you can get so much Victorian smut for free. I will say Victorian smut comes with every content warning that you can think of. If you can think of it, it's in there.
I was joking. When I was kind of prepping for this podcast, I was saying that I wanted to ask this question and, would that be okay? Because we try to keep it a family friendly podcast, and, was like, oh, well, it's probably just like flash and ankles. And I was like,
Oh
I don't
no,
think
it
so.
is not
I
just
don't think
flash and
so.
ankles. No, to like to keep it family friendly, I won't get too detailed. It is hardcore. It is intense. Some of it is kind of fun, but it's like juxtaposed sometimes against stuff that's just like, I cannot unread this. The
Mm,
first book in the series, The Gentleman's Book of Vices, one of the main characters is an erotica writer. He's one of Paul's authors.
yeah.
And then his the other hero in that story is one of his readers, and so there's sort of a lot more jokes and things about just like how freaking dark and like depraved things get in the Victorian era. So if that's your vibe, you can go get it for free. Just know every trigger warning, everything, if more, even if you can't think of it, it might show up
It
anyway,
might be in there.
because it is not kidding around.
I'm not surprised personally. I think some people would have been, but I am
Yeah.
not. I know the Victorians were into some creepy stuff, like
Yes.
especially with like death stuff, but I imagine that they were also into some weird sex stuff too. Like,
Correct.
yeah, I can think of some things that I'm sure probably do appear that I'm not going to talk about. But yeah, I'm not surprised. I think that they were a very sexually repressed society, and that
Indeed.
comes with
It
consequences.
sure does. Yep. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, that is interesting. So just out of curiosity for myself, would there have been like pictures?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Oh,
because yeah, like
photography was coming about now too. So yeah.
mhm.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Amazing. Okay,
Mhm.
well, enough with Victorian porn. I've probably managed to talk about that for about as long as the
As you are
family friendly
able in this
podcast
podcast,
would
that's
would
fair.
let me. But if we ever have an explicit edition, I would love to get into it with you because I
Cool.
think that
Just keep
sounds
me posted.
so fascinating. So that really wraps up like my historical questions. But what do you see kind of going forward in the series? You said there's going to be another book. Have you started working on it? Like, what can
Yeah, so I've
you?
written a draft of that and turned it in. I'm waiting on edits for it right now. So I
Amazing.
will sort of be finishing it up in the next few months. It comes out in 2025. It does not have a title yet or an
Mm-hmm.
exact release date. For those who've read the series, it just kind of, I've got like a loose end character. Warren, the bartender, he's the bartender at the Curious Fox. He was just like this loose end character. I'm like, I can't just close this series out without, Warren needs a book. So Warren got a book. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that is what would I call the trope? It's a little bit grumpy meets grumpy kind of situation. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
forbidden element to it that goes beyond the societal element.
Right.
But because of certain circumstances, the owner of the Curious Fox, does not want Warren to be with the guy that he meets in this art class that they go
Oh,
to.
interesting. He's
Um,
such a matchmaker.
he is such a matchmaker, so it's very rare that he would not
Mm-hmm.
want someone to be together. But for reasons that kind of spoil book two, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, he has some good reasons for why he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't want this to be, but it's going to be
Mm.
anyway.
Interesting. Love it. Well, that's really exciting and I'm looking forward to seeing those hit the shelves. But in the meantime, this book is brand new, so congratulations on that. I think as you're listening, it probably will have just been released. So, everybody who is interested should definitely drop by their local bookstore, preferably their local independent bookstore, and pick up a copy and check it out. I unfortunately, this is my first of your books that I have gotten to read, but I loved your writing. I loved this story, and I'm actually even more excited about picking up other books from the series, knowing that they're all kind of connected to each other in
Mhm.
that way, that they are all people who kind of know each other and hang out in the same circle. Because I loved Noah and David's relationship in the book, and I didn't know that it was the subject matter of a previous book, which
Yes.
almost makes it better. And now I'm like curious. I wish I kind of could have had that experience of reading them in order, so that I'd have like been along for the ride, so to speak, of their like blossoming and turning into what is in this book a very steady relationship. Like that
I
would have
think
been
you might really enjoy it having seen where it goes to. Sometimes there's something fun about reading things out of
right.
order. So you'll just get a different experience, but I bet you'll still have a good time.
Yeah, for sure. Also, one more thing I wanted to say. I didn't feel like there was a huge third act breakup in this. Um, I liked that. I'm
Yay.
not a fan of the third act breakup
Okay.
personally.
I know a lot of
So
people are not.
yeah, yeah. So like this had like a third act like how are we going to define this relationship moment, but like not a full-fledged third act breakup. And I thought that that was refreshing.
That was
So
so
I
well
just wanted to
timed.
shout
Like
that
I
out.
said, I was in like such a like annoying place in my life while I was writing it. I didn't want all this like angst. So I sent it to my
Mhm.
editor. I'm like, I'm sorry, there's no conflict. And she's like, it's cool. No one likes the third act breakup anymore. And I was like, great, this is
Yeah,
perfect timing.
yeah. I guess it's out of fashion now.
Yes, and I
But
was
if
lucky.
you, as the listener, are also not a fan of the third act breakup, this one is basically third act breakup free. So you can just enjoy good sapphic vibes with a bit of an enemies to lovers flair to it. So you still get that heat. You still get the like, will they, won't they? They have a little bit of fighting, but it's not like a breakup fight. And I like that. So I loved this book. I think listeners will also love this book. And congratulations to you on yet another addition to your fantastic series.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to close this out with my usual closeout from Make It Gay, which is stay gay and keep reading.